like to thank the entities that made this opportunity possible for me. Certainly the University of Notre Dame, the local alumni club, as well as Newman University. I really appreciate the interest in something that I find to be fundamentally really important. So today we're going to talk about successful aging. And one of the comments I made to a couple of people in the audience is that you don't have to be old to be aging. So a lot of times we tie those two words together, but each one of us is aging. And so we can think about this process across the entire lifespan. So I believe, I may or may not be true, but I believe that you are here because you don't just want to add quantity to your life, but you want to add quality to those later years. I also believe that aging is a very individualized process. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today will apply to you, but other things will not. I believe that aging, whether it's successful or not, is really a complex process. And it's very hard to pare it down into a few sort of easy sound bites. If you do this, then you'll have a successful life. It really involves the coming together of biological influences, diseases, heredity, psychological factors, how do you cope with adversity, what personality type do you have? And also one's network of supports, that is the extent to which you're integrated into the fabric of friendships and our society. So what I'd like to do, if I can actually run this machine, what I'd like to do is start with a quiz, which is why you all have a pencil and a piece of paper. See, I'm this professor that just likes to give quizzes. Actually, this quiz is in how long will you live? Is there anyone who doesn't have paper or pencil? So there's folks are going to grab paper and pencil for you. If you've got an extra pencil, or you could tear your paper in half. Mostly what I'm going to ask you to do is a little bit of math. A little bit of math. Is everybody who wants to figure out how long they're likely to live, do you have a paper and pencil? All right. Are you ready? All right. I want everybody to write the number 72 on their piece of paper.
What if we're already over 72?
We're going to start with 72. Everybody starts with 72. And we're going to add and subtract based on characteristics that I'm going to highlight for you. All right, if you're a male, I want you to subtract 3. If you're a female, add 4. Sorry, guys. If you live in an urban area with a population over 2 million people, subtract 2. If you live in a town under 10,000 or on a farm, add 2.
6. You said 6? 2.
Add 2. If you live in a town under 10,000, add 2. If you're just suburban, you do nothing. If any grandparent lived to the age of 85, add 2. If all 4 of your grandparents lived to age 80, add 6 more. You only get to count it once.
Okay.
If either of your parents died of a stroke or a heart attack before the age of 50, subtract 4. If any parent brother or sister under the age of 50 has or had cancer or a heart condition or has had diabetes since childhood, subtract 3. If you earn over $50,000 a year, subtract 2. You didn't think I was going that way, did you? If you finished college, add 1. If you have a graduate or a professional degree, add 2 more. If you finished college, add 1. If you have a graduate or a professional degree, add 2 more. If you're 65 or older and you're still working, add 3. If you live with a spouse or a friend, add 5. If not, subtract 1 for every 10 years you've lived alone since the age of 25. Is that too confusing? If you live with a spouse or friend, add 5. If not, subtract 1 for every 10 years you've lived alone since the age of 25. If you work behind a desk, add 3. If you work behind a desk, subtract 3. Sorry, got that totally wrong. I would think about what you did the majority of your life. If you work or worked behind a desk, subtract 3. If your work requires regular, heavy physical labor, add 3. If you exercise strenuously, playing tennis, running, swimming, 5 times a week for at least half an hour, add 4. If you do it 2 or 3 times a week, add 2. If you sleep more than 10 hours each night, subtract 4. The students think that one's really funny too. If you're intense, aggressive, and easily angered, subtract 3. If you're easygoing and relaxed, add 3. Do not ask anyone which you are. You have to know for yourself. Spouses cannot correct your math in any way. If you're happy, add 1. If you're unhappy, subtract 2. If you've had a speeding ticket in the past year, subtract 1. If you smoke more than 2 packs of cigarettes a day, subtract 8. If you smoke 1 or 2 packs, subtract 6. If you smoke 1 to 1.5, subtract 3. That's a good clue as to something, if you want to live long, you could control. If you drink the equivalent of 1.5 ounces of liquor a day, subtract 1. If you're overweight by 50 pounds or more, subtract 8. By 30 to 50 pounds, subtract 4. By 10 to 30 pounds, subtract 2. If you're a man and over 40 and you have annual checkups, add 2. If you're a woman and see a gynecologist once a year, add 2. And now we're going to do the age adjustment that someone in the back wanted. So if you're between 30 and 40, add 2. If you're between 40 and 50, add 3. If you're between 50 and 70, add 4. And if you're over 70, add 5. Okay, that number that you have there, if your math is correct, is your estimate of how long you're likely to live. So how many people are going to live into their 70s? How many into their 80s? How many into their 90s? How many 100? So see, I'm going to learn more from you guys than you're going to learn from me. How many of you should already be dead? You know, maybe this is our successful ager here, beating the odds. So this is kind of a fun activity that helps us get a sense for some of the factors that influence our life expectancy. There are a lot of these, especially on the internet. So I was looking at different ones. Some of them have to do with the types of food you eat. So if you eat a lot of charred food, that's not good for you. If you eat a lot of red meat, that takes years off. But there's this one that you go through the entire process, and then it tells you how long you're likely to live, and then it puts a little coffin icon at the bottom of your screen, and it counts away the seconds. And you're sitting there, you're like, oh my God, I'm wasting seconds of my life. I had to take the icon off. It was really a little bit too overwhelming for me. So some of the factors that are particularly important, as we mentioned, smoking, obesity, poor health care, a lack of social support, pollution, an aggressive or an angry, intense personality are all problematic. Factors that are important, things like a good marriage. My dad suggested that you didn't live longer, it just seemed like you did, but I don't think that's really true. Another piece that seems to be really important is heredity. So a lot of the genealogical research over years has determined that if you want to increase your chances of living a long life, you need to come from a family of long-lived people. It's the case, though, that what we may inherit in our families may not be a gene for longevity per se, but what we probably inherit is frailties. That is, susceptibilities to different types of diseases, cardiovascular disease or diabetes, that is likely to shorten our lives. Another piece that is extremely important is feeling useful. A study of individuals that lived to be 100 said the most important thing was having something that they needed to do every single day. They had a reason to get up in the morning. So feeling useful is extraordinarily important to successful aging and having a long life. So you all came to a talk on successful aging, but each one of you would probably define it in a different way. And so how might we define successful aging? There really isn't any consensus on what that means. So one criterion that is often espoused is this idea of longevity. Living a long life is particularly important. But as we mentioned at the onset, longevity is probably only one component. Most of us would prefer to add quality to those later years and not just quantity. So for every year we add to the life expectancy, right now for every 4 years we add, only one of those is a quality year. So it's that conversation between keeping people alive longer and having lives that have a lot of meaning and quality to them. So a lot of the focus has gone beyond just kind of life expectancy or longevity, and it focuses on things like the quality of someone's life or how satisfied they are with their life, in concert with physical health and mental health. Another really important area in thinking about successful aging, and this is one that I'm particularly interested in, is how we deal with adversity across our lifespan. So stressful life events have been negatively associated with both physical and mental health disorders. People who are more stressed have more health problems, they have higher levels of depression, and they have lower levels of life satisfaction. But some people really manage to maintain high levels of self-esteem, good physical health, and a positive outlook on life in spite of the fact that they face the same adversities that lead other people to give up, to get sick, and to lose hope. So why is it that some people age more optimally than others? Why do some people thrive in the face of adversity? So, show of hands here. How many of you have had sweaty hands when you've gone to a social event and you don't really know anyone? How many of you have been walking alone at night and you hear a noise and your heart starts racing, you feel like the hair on the back of your neck is standing on end? All right, how many of you felt sick when you had to do something that you didn't really want to do? Maybe you had to give somebody bad news. How many of you have felt jittery or shaky when you're waiting for an important job interview or something that's really important to you? Okay. How many of you think you've ever been stressed? Okay, clearly my work here is done. So one of the pieces to this puzzle is this fight or flee response. How many have heard of the fight or flee response? Okay? From an evolutionary perspective, this is really beneficial. In the long term, with chronic health or chronic stress problems, it can result in some very particular health type problems. So let's talk a little bit about stress. So stress is the degree to which individuals see their lives as being unpredictable, uncontrollable, or overloaded. And there's some different types of stress. So one type of stress we call acute stress. These are stressors that come and go pretty quickly. So maybe you're driving down the road, someone runs a red light, and you think you're going to be hit. That physiological response, many of the things that I just asked you about, the racing heart, the change in body temperature, the change in our rate of breathing, all of those things are associated with this acute stress response. So I remember when my oldest daughter was in high school, she didn't have a date for the junior prom, and it really was the end of the world. And, in retrospect, she never had to put that on her college applications. Her future spouse didn't ask her if she had had a date for the prom. She didn't have to put it on her resume, anything like that. So at the time, this was the end of the world. But in retrospect, it may or may not have been. I haven't asked her how important it really was and whether it was a life-changing moment. And that's a little bit of an extreme example because for adolescents, those social experiences are really fundamentally important. But sometimes we set ourselves up to that this is so important when in fact, really, it may not be. So we really need to ask ourselves, how important is this, and is it worth getting upset about? Another thing that we can do is we can adjust our standards. So perfectionism is a major source of avoidable stress. We need to stop setting ourselves up for failure by demanding perfection. So we need to set reasonable standards. for ourselves and for other people. And we need to be okay with good enough and save our perfection for when we really need it. So there are some things that we may want or need to do perfectly, so to speak, but there are other things that may or may not matter in that same kind of way. It's also important to make time for fun and relaxation. You know, when things get us down, it's really nice to be able to spend positive time with, in this case, young children. Young children are fabulous from that standpoint. But we need to do something that we enjoy. And one of the things when we're under a lot of stress, often the person who gets sort of left behind is yourself. So one thing that is extraordinarily important is to do something that you enjoy every single day. Doesn't matter what it is, something that you enjoy, do something just for yourself. Because we need to remember that nurturing ourselves isn't a luxury. Nurturing ourselves is a necessity. Because it's important to remember that self-care really isn't something that's selfish. Because you can't serve from an empty vessel. We also need to learn to accept the things that we can't change. So we're always going to have stress in our lives. Some of it is going to be uncontrollable. We can't prevent or change some kinds of stressors, the death of a loved one, a serious illness, a national recession. In these types of cases, the best way to cope with stress is to accept things the way they are. Accepting them might be difficult, but in the long run, it's easier than railing against a situation that you can't do anything about. But it's also important to look for the upside. You know, as that saying goes, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So when we're facing these major life challenges, we need to look at them as opportunities for personal growth. So think about life this way. Life is not a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in, broadside, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, "Wow, what a ride." So, aging is a very emotional journey. And for all that we know about it, we really don't know that much. Is it the luck of the draw? Is it the spin of the roulette wheel? Or is it something that we can control? Some risk factors we know are preventable or modifiable, but others might not be. But we can learn to be more resilient in the face of adversity. And from a research perspective, understanding resilience, what it is, how it develops, how we use it, will help us to understand who is likely to flourish and who is not. So perhaps Winnie the Pooh and his friends had it right. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats to different sources of stress, such as family relationship problems, serious health problems, workplace problems, financial stressors. What it means is bouncing back from these difficult experiences. So life is not about how fast you run or how high you climb, but how well you bounce. So resilience isn't a trait that people either have or they don't have. It involves behaviors, thoughts, actions that can be learned and can be developed in anyone. So promise me that you'll always remember that you're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Dr. Bergman will stay and answer questions, and if any of you have to leave for whatever reason, feel free to do so. Raise your hand, whatever.
You didn't have fear of spouts in the score.
Fear of spouse? No. I did not have fear of spouse. As I told you, my father would say, with a lot of these things that I'm talking about, you know, eating well and being married, you don't live longer, it just feels like you do. That was one of his sayings. Yeah.
How much of today's memory problems amongst most older people, but also younger people, have to do with stress?
So
With all the Alzheimer's and stuff that's going on, is that really a DNA type thing, or is it actually caused by stress?
So he had a question that is the relationship between stress and some of the dementias that we see, primarily Alzheimer's disease. Is that something that is in our DNA? Is it something that is associated with trauma or environmental experiences? The answer is all of the above. So there are many, many different genes that have been identified in Alzheimer's disease, but it maybe accounts for 10 or 15% of the people who might develop Alzheimer's disease. So there are some types, some families where it clearly runs in the family for genetic reasons. It's hard to understand that though, because the age and onset for Alzheimer's disease is later life, and some people might die from something else before they would develop Alzheimer's, so we don't really see these clear patterns within families. And seeing it within families means that it could be hereditary, but it could also be due to shared environmental exposures. So there are a lot of different theories about Alzheimer's. We do know that the experience of stress influences changes in cognitive functioning. Would I say that there's a link between stress and Alzheimer's? No. But there is a link between stress and having difficulty with your cognitive functioning because of this worry that surrounds the particular stressor. You're using some of your intellectual capacity to deal with the worry or the fear or the anxiety. It's also the case that there are links between cardiovascular disease and dementias, the multi-infarct dementias due to the small strokes. So there could be more direct links with that type of dementia. But we don't have any clear linkage between the experience of stress, even chronic stress, and Alzheimer's disease per se. It doesn't help. Stress doesn't help Alzheimer's disease, but there's no evidence that it's a major player in that disorder.
I read or heard somewhere the other day that half of the babies born today may live to be 100 years old. As we get older, so much more medical care is needed. How can we afford to keep all this stuff going?
No worries. We have a president in the White House that's going to make America great again. No worries about that. He's got our best interests at heart. I'm positive of it. Yeah.
But you were talking before about the DNA and the DNA mapping that we've done to this point. Has that made a difference in identifying possible mutations within the DNA that people that can't handle stress have a similar problem for one of the strains are messed?
So there is a a gene on chromosome 19. It's called the apoplioprotein E, and there's 3 different alleles. There's type 2, there's type 3, and there's type 4. So 3 different variants of what you could have. And because you have 2 genes, you could have 2 of each kind, or you could have some kind of mixture. So the 3 seem to be kind of neutral. The 2 seem to be protective for Alzheimer's, and the 4s, the more 4s you have, the more likely you're to develop Alzheimer's. But this particular type of Alzheimer's is, again, it's a propensity for Alzheimer's. You could have 2 of these alleles and never develop Alzheimer's. This is the type of Alzheimer's that's more likely to occur in very advanced old age, so late 80s and 90s. It's not the type that has a young onset. So it is the case that in some of these things, because it has to do with a broader sort of physiological mechanism that's in place, can't go into all those details, that would be a situation in which stress could play a bigger role in sort of pushing you with that predisposition toward Alzheimer's versus not.
I wasn't referencing the Alzheimer's.
Okay.
Just handling stress. The ability of, you have 10 people will handle the same situation in their appropriate manner. Some just flow it off, others will worry about it for 3 weeks. Has there been more research now that we have the mapping to start to look at the genes and how this group of genes does much better with stress than another group?
I'm not familiar with any work that would probably ask the question in exactly that kind of way. So part of the successfulness of this genome-wide scanning and looking for these different markers that are associated with different behaviors or diseases or whatever it is that we're interested in, those require a really well-defined kind of phenotype. What is it that you're looking at? So if you were looking at personality, for example, so you thought that people with a certain personality type was more likely to deal with stress in one way versus another. So let's say you're easygoing and you're sort of unlikely to be affected versus you're very intense, easily angered, etc. So if that is your dimension, then you could begin to look at genetic influences on those characteristics. And there is evidence, although we don't know the exact markers, that personality traits run in families. They're not as heritable as some other characteristics. But shyness, for example, is a very heritable characteristic. Neuroticism is. So if we were to say, what about personality? What about social support? So you could take something like social support and look at whether or not there are genetic differences in people who are good at making and maintaining friendships versus those who aren't. So I think it's more, if you could sort of define that resilience resource, if you will, as the phenotype you're interested in, then you could look at genetic differences in that, and then maybe you could look at the way in which they experience stress, these mechanisms, and then the effect on outcomes. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
I think it's the phenotype that's the hardest piece.
I think that answers the question I kind of had. I was going to ask if you think, I know you discussed resilience being something you build, but do you think it is second nature to some people versus
I think some people are dispositionally, it's easier for them to develop resilience, but I think it has a lot to do with parenting, and if you have someone who always does things for you, you don't ever develop those skills. So then, you get to adulthood and you're kind of helpless because someone has always been there to do that. So, I do think it's a combination of factors, but definitely some people have different personality traits that make it easier. It may be harder for someone who's shy, for example, to really develop a broad social network. But there's evidence that suggests that people who are shy actually use their network to help them deal with stress, whereas people who are more outgoing use their social network to meet those affiliative needs that they have. So the
One
answer
more
is
question,
maybe
one
some
more back there.
combination.
How about one more back in the back?
Yep.
Yes, I'm wondering, since a strong marriage is important or seems to have very positive ramifications, I'm wondering if there have been any studies done that looks at the resiliency of spouses that have been in a long-term marriage after the death of a spouse.
We have actually done a study kind of in that vein. So we were interested in sort of major life stressors that people experience, and certainly the loss of a spouse is a major one. And we were interested in how people sort of recover from that loss. And when you talk to widows, they talk about this emotional roller coaster that they're on. Sometimes they feel pretty good and then they just plummet. And so we did a study where we collected data on widows every day for 98 days after the loss of their spouse. And we asked them about their emotions, their positive and negative emotions, and we could actually use an analytic technique called dynamic systems analysis, which comes out of fluid physics, but it allows us to model that actual roller coaster. And what we found was that there were influences on the quality of the marriage. So it's interesting that it was a curvilinear relationship. So really strong marriages and really poor marriages showed kind of a similar effect. So losing your best friend apparently has a similar effect to losing your major adversary. You no longer have someone to spar with. I don't know. But it was interesting that it wasn't the better the marriage, either the easier or the worse the loss. But it was again a curvilinear relationship. So. And having a really strong marriage in many ways made it more difficult because you had lost your best friend and that type of thing. But we did some other kind of interesting things with the data, looking at factors that sort of influenced how frequently people oscillate from high to low and how quickly they sort of are able to damp back down. So I thought it was a really interesting study, and there's still things we haven't sort of finished understanding, but we were really interested in that idea. Right now we're doing a study with couples where we're looking at how couples within marital relationships either help to sort of synchronize or moderate the stress affect relationship, the extent to which they exacerbate the stress versus help the person adjust. So we're looking at these relationships within couples right now.
Thank you very much, Dr.